The night was alive, a restless beast that coiled around the cattle ranch, its breath cold and heavy against my skin. The air carried the scent of damp earth hay and the faint musk of thousands of sleeping cattle, their presence a low hum in the darkness. My boots scraped against the gravel, each step a small defiance against the silence that seemed to watch me waiting for a mistake. In the late 1980s, I was a security guard on a sprawling cattle ranch in a forgotten corner of the American Midwest. The job was solitary, unglamorous, a grind of endless patrols under a sky that rarely showed mercy. But I liked it, the quiet, the weight of responsibility, the way the night stripped away lies and left only raw truth. I thought I knew the dark thought. I understood its rhythms. That night, I learned how wrong I was when the dark wore a wolf's skin and sang a song of madness. 2 weeks earlier, a worker in the on-site dorms had whispered about a shadow moving near the cattle sheds, someone who didn't belong. The other guards had swept the grounds, found nothing, and chalked it up to paranoia. But I'd been around long enough to know that smoke meant fire, even if you couldn't see the flames. Tonight, my senses were sharp. My flashlight, a thin blade of light, cutting through the inky void. Rex, one of the ranch's dogs, walked beside me, his ears twitching at every rustle, his eyes glinting in the faint glow of my beam. He was a good dog, loyal, but wary, trained to sense trouble before it showed its face. The cattle sheds loomed ahead, their wooden frames jagged against a starless sky, like the ribs of some ancient creature left to rot. At night, the sheds were a world apart, not loud, not chaotic, but charged with an energy that pressed against your chest. Thousands of cattle bedded down or shifting in their pens gave the air a pulse, a living weight that made your skin prickle. I wasn't a poet, but I felt it, a primal buzz, the kind that reminded you how thin the line was between man and beast. Rex felt it too. His hackles rose as we neared the central yard, a wide-open space flanked by the sheds, where the shadows seemed to pool like spilled ink. I saw him before I understood what I was seeing. A shape too tall, too deliberate, moving aimlessly in the yard's heart. My pulse quickened, not from fear, not yet, but from certainty. This was no worker, no stray calf. This was the shadow from the whispers, the fire behind the smoke. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam slicing through the night to pin him in place. The light caught a man broad-shouldered and tall, his outline warped by something draped over him, a rug, a cloak, or something worse. As my eyes adjusted, The truth hit like a punch, a wolf's pelt, raw and ragged. The head still attached, its empty sockets, staring blankly from atop his own. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steady, but edged with steel. Rex growled low, his body tensing, his teeth bared in the flashlight's glow. The man turned slowly, facing the beam without a flinch. His eyes caught the light, glinting like polished obsidian, unblinking, as if the glare was nothing more than moonlight on a still lake. Up close, the pelt was no costume. It was crude, freshly skinned, the kind of thing you'd wear if you wanted to become something else. Beneath it, he was ordinary worn jeans, scuffed boots, a face carved by years of hard living. But his gaze was anything but ordinary. It was hungry, predatory, sizing me up like a wolf circling a lone deer. "Identify yourself," I said, my hand inching toward the holster at my hip. "This is private property. You don't belong here." He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, the pelt shifting to reveal a blade long curved its edge, glinting with malicious intent, hanging from his belt. Rex's growl deepened, vibrating through the air, and I tightened my grip on his leash, ready to release him if this went wrong. The man's lips curled into a sneer, not a smile, but a baring of teeth, like an animal staking its claim. Then, without warning, he threw his head back and howled. The sound was raw, guttural, a primal cry that tore through the night like a blade through flesh. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was the voice of something wild, something that belonged to the deep woods, to the shadows where men didn't tread. The cattle stirred their low moans, rising into a restless chorus, hooves scraping against wood. Rex yelped, his courage crumbling, and before I could stop him, he yanked free and bolted into the dark, his leash slipping through my fingers like water. Just me and him now. My heart pounded, but I forced a laugh, trying to shatter the spell of that howl. "What is this? Some kind of prank?" I said, though my voice betrayed a tremor. "You're trespassing. Last chance to explain yourself before I call this in." He didn't laugh back. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine, that sneer twisting his face into something monstrous. The flashlight trembled in my hand, casting jagged shadows across the yard, his silhouette stretching across the sheds, the wolf's head looming like a grotesque crown. The cattle were louder now, their bellows a rising tide, their fear feeding mine. The air grew thick, heavy, with the scent of damp fur, sweat, and something sharper, something like blood. I reached for my radio, my fingers fumbling for the button. "Base, "This is perimeter," I said, never breaking eye contact. "Intruder near the sheds. Send backup and call the cops. Now." The radio crackled with static, then fell silent. The man didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, the wolf's head atop his own, its jaws frozen in a silent snarl. I repeated my call, my voice sharper, but he didn't care. He was watching me, waiting like a predator who knew his prey was trapped. The cattle's bellows grew frantic, a cacophony of panic that drowned out the thud of my own pulse. "Last chance," I said, my hand now on my gun, my thumb flicking the holster's strap. "Who are you, and what do you want?" That's when he moved. Not a step, not a lunge, but a charge. Like a beast breaking cover. He was on me. Before I could draw his weight, slamming into me, sending me sprawling to the dirt. The flashlight skittered across the ground, its beam spinning wildly, painting the sheds in fleeting, chaotic light. The wolf's head loomed above me, its empty eyes staring, as he pinned me down, his hands closing around my throat. He's going to kill me. The thought was cold, clear, cutting through the fog of panic. His grip tightened, my lungs burning my vision, swimming with spots. The cattle roared their hooves, a thunder that shook the earth. Their fear, a mirror of my own. His face was inches from mine, his breath hot and sour, his eyes wild, with something I couldn't name. Madness, rage, or something older, something that didn't belong in a human soul. The pelt's fur brushed my cheek, coarse and damp, its stench filling my nose, a mix of death and wildness. But I wasn't ready to die. With a surge of strength, I bucked beneath him, twisting my hips and throwing him off. He stumbled, the pelt slipping, to reveal more of that wicked blade at his belt. I scrambled to my feet, my hand closing around my gun, but before I could draw, he was up again, howling a sound that sent a shiver down my spine, primal and wrong, like a curse spoken in a tongue I didn't know. The cattle were in chaos, their bellows a deafening storm, hooves pounding like war drums. And then, from the darkness, a new sound, barking. Rex, my traitor dog, had found his courage and was charging back, his teeth bared, his eyes locked on the wolf-clad man. The man spun his howl, turning to a snarl, and for a moment they faced off, dog and monster, each daring the other to move. I lunged for my flashlight, its beam catching him full in the face. He flinched, raising a hand to shield his eyes, and Rex leaped, jaws snapping, forcing him back. The pelt flapped like a grotesque cape, the wolf's head sliding askew, revealing more of his face, ordinary, almost pitiful, if not for the madness in his eyes. I aimed my gun, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't. He barked back at Rex, a guttural unhinged sound, like a beast answering its own kind. I froze my finger, hovering over the trigger, my mind struggling to process the wrongness of it all. Footsteps, shouts. Relief flooded me as John, my colleague, burst into the yard, his shotgun raised. The man didn't back down. He threw his head back and howled again, a sound so piercing it seemed to crack the night itself. John didn't hesitate. He charged forward and swung the butt of his shotgun, catching the man square in the temple. The wolf-clad figure crumpled the pelt sliding off to reveal a man ordinary, unremarkable, except for the madness that still flickered in his half-closed eyes. John zip-tied his wrists, his movements quick and precise, while I caught my breath, my hands shaking as I holstered my gun. The cattle were still restless, their moans a low, mournful dirge. Rex circled the fallen man, growling softly, his loyalty restored. The flashlight's beam lay across the yard, illuminating the pelt where it had fallen, a lifeless thing. Now its power broken, but its presence still heavy, like a shadow that refused to fade. The cops arrived 20 minutes later, their lights flashing red and blue against the sheds, cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in. The owners and a manager showed up too, their faces pale, their voices hushed. The truth came out in fragments, each one more surreal than the last. The man was the manager's brother, a drifter who'd stumbled into town, drowned himself in whiskey, and decided to pay a visit. Somewhere between the bar and the ranch, he'd acquired the wolf pelt, the knife, and a thirst for violence that no one could explain. He hadn't meant to kill me, he claimed later, when the liquor had burned off and the cuffs were tight around his wrists. Just wanted to scare someone, to feel alive. But I saw his eyes that night, those obsidian glints that held no trace of humanity, and I knew better. There was something in him that wasn't his own, something that wore a man's face, but howled like a beast, something that belonged to the dark and had slipped its leash. The ranch paid me a bonus, gave me better shifts, a raise. The manager made sure of it, his guilt etched into every forced smile, every awkward handshake. But money didn't erase the memory. I still patrolled. Those sheds still felt the weight of the night pressing against me, its breath cold and watchful. Sometimes, when the cattle stirred and the wind carried a faint, distant cry, I'd grip my flashlight tighter, my eyes scanning the shadows for a glint of obsidian, for a shape that didn't belong The howl stayed with me, a scar on my soul, a reminder that the dark holds truths no man should face. But the story doesn't end there. Weeks later, I overheard the workers talking their voices low, their eyes darting to the sheds. They said the cattle had been restless since that night, refusing to settle their eyes wide with a fear no one could explain. One of the older hands, a man who'd worked the ranch for decades, pulled me aside one evening, his face lined with worry. "That pelt," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They burned it, you know. But I heard something last night out by the sheds, a howl like the one you described. And the cattle, they wouldn't move, just stood there, staring at nothing." I laughed it off, told him it was just the wind, but my stomach twisted. That night, I took my usual route, Rex at my side, his ears pricked, his body tense. The sheds were quiet, the cattle bedded down, but the air felt wrong, too heavy, too still. I swept my flashlight across the yard, its beam catching nothing but dirt and shadows. But as I turned to leave, Rex froze, his growl low and guttural, his eyes fixed on the far edge of the yard, where the darkness seemed to pulse just beyond the light. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. But I felt it, a presence watching, waiting its breath, cold against my neck. I called Rex and walked away, my steps quick, my hand on my gun. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some things you just know, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see those obsidian eyes, still hear that howl, still feel the weight of the night pressing down, whispering truths I'll never fully understand. My heart stopped the moment Papa's eyes turned to ice, staring through me, like I was a specter from a war he'd never left. The air on our family's grain farm that day was heavy, saturated with the gritty scent of wheat dust and the sharp tang of machine oil that clung to my skin like a second shadow. I was 16, all limbs and calluses from summers spent hauling sacks of grain under the relentless sun. Papa, my grandfather, walked beside me, his boots kicking up clouds of dry earth. He was the rock of our family, stern, quiet, with hands scarred from decades of toil and battles I could only imagine. But that afternoon, something shattered inside him, and the man who'd taught me to carve wooden birds became a stranger, dragging me toward the ravenous jaws of a threshing machine that pulsed with a hunger for flesh. Our farm sprawled across acres of golden wheat, a sea of swaying stalks that stretched to the horizon. The sun hung low, painting the fields in hues of amber and shadow. In the distance, The threshing sheds loomed their corrugated metal walls, glinting like the scales of some ancient beast. The machines inside roared a relentless hum that vibrated through the ground into my bones. I'd grown up with that sound, a heartbeat of our livelihood. My father was the foreman, a man of few words, who commanded the workers and machines with quiet authority. My mother's sister and I lived in a weathered farmhouse on the property, its porch creaking under the weight of countless evenings spent listening to Papa's stories. Papa lived with us, his presence a steady comfort, even as age slowed his steps. He loved his walks across the farm, tracing paths he'd known since he was a boy. That day, I joined him, expecting nothing more than idle talk about school or the harvest. How could I have known that within minutes I'd be fighting for my life against the man who'd bandaged my scraped knees? The fields were alive with the rhythm of late summer. Crickets chirped in the underbrush, their song drowned out by the distant drone of the threshers. The air was warm, thick, with the earthy sweetness of cut grain and the faint bitterness of diesel. Papa's flannel shirt hung loose on his frame, his gray hair catching the sunlight as we walked toward the sheds. I was mid-sentence, complaining about a history test, when he stopped. Abruptly, his body rigid as a fence post, his face, usually etched with gentle lines, twisted into something alien, eyes, wide pupils, swallowing the hazel. I knew lips trembling with a silent curse. "You," he hissed, his voice low and guttural. Nothing like the warm baritone that had soothed me through childhood fears. His finger stabbed the air, pointing at me. "You're here to kill me." The words hit like a slap, sharp and surreal, freezing the breath in my lungs. I laughed, a nervous reflex, thinking it was some grim joke. But the sound withered in my throat when I saw his eyes, cold, unyielding, the eyes of a man staring down a predator. "Papa, it's me," I said, my voice cracking like dry twigs. He didn't hear me. He lunged his hand, clamping around my wrist with a strength that defied his 70 years. His grip was a vice, bruising my skin as he yanked me forward toward the threshing sheds. My sneakers slipped on loose gravel, my free hand flailing for balance. "Papa, stop," I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the wind and the machine's relentless hum. His boots thudded against the earth, purposeful, driven by a madness I couldn't comprehend. What was happening? Why was he doing this? The sheds rose ahead, their open doors, like the mouths of caves, exhaling clouds of grain dust that shimmered in the fading light. The threshers inside were running unmanned, for the moment their steel blades spinning in a blur of silver. The air grew thicker, choking with the scent of oil and metal, the dust stinging my eyes. until they watered. Papa dragged me into the shed, his strength unyielding his face, a mask of rage and terror. "I won't let you take me," he screamed, his voice echoing off the metal walls, mingling with the thresher's roar. My heart hammered a frantic drumbeat that drowned out reason. He's not seeing me. I realized a sickening clarity cutting through the panic. He's seeing someone else, something from his past. I remembered a story Papa told me when I was 8, sitting on the porch with a glass of lemonade sweating in my hand. He'd been a soldier, barely older than I was, now fighting in a war he never named. His voice had trembled as he spoke of a night in a foreign field, facing an enemy in the dark. I saw death in his eyes, he'd said, staring at the horizon. But I lived. Was that what he saw in me now? A ghost from that night, come to settle an old score. The thought clawed at my chest, but there was no time to dwell. The thresher's hatch loomed ahead, a gaping maw where grain poured in and blades churned below a machine that could reduce flesh to nothing in seconds. My sneakers skidded on the packed dirt floor, kicking up clouds of dust that coated my tongue. I grabbed Papa's arm, trying to pry his fingers off my wrist. But he was immovable, a force of nature fueled by delusion. "You won't take me," he roared again, his voice cracking with desperation. The thresher's hum filled my skull, a relentless pulse that seemed to sync with my racing heartbeat. Grain spilled from the hatch, pinging against my face, like tiny needles, sharp and relentless. The smell of oil was overwhelming, thick and acrid, mingling with the metallic tang of the blades. My eyes burned, my vision blurring, but I couldn't look away from the machine. One misstep, and we're both gone. I twisted harder, my shoulder screaming in pain, and managed to wrench my wrist free for a fleeting moment. But Papa was on me again, his hands clawing at my shirt, tearing the cotton with a ripping sound that cut through the noise. He was screaming now, a jumble of words, curses, pleas, fragments of a past I'd never know. I stumbled, my back slamming against the thresher's metal frame, the vibration rattling my teeth. The hatch was inches away, the blades a silver storm that seemed to pulse with intent. I could feel the heat of the machine, the hot air blasting against my cheeks like the breath of a beast. This is it, I thought, panic flooding my veins like ice. I'm going to die. But something ignited in me a spark of defiance, a refusal to let this be the end. I wasn't just fighting Papa. I was fighting for him, for the man who'd carried me on his shoulders through these same fields. I grabbed his waist, my arms trembling with effort, and lifted him off the ground. He was heavy, solid as an oak, but adrenaline surged through me, a primal strength I didn't know I possessed. Like those stories of mothers lifting cars to save their kids, I thought the memory anchoring me in the chaos. Papa thrashed his fists, pounding my shoulders, his boots kicking at my shins. But I held on, staggering away from the thresher's hungry mouth. We toppled backward, hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud. My breath rushed out pain, exploding in my ribs like a firecracker. Papa was on me in an instant, his weight pinning me down, his hands clawing at my face. "You'll regret this," he screamed, his voice raw, unhinged, his breath hot against my skin. The thresher's roar was deafening, a ravenous beast waiting for its prize. Grain dust choked the air, coating my throat, making every breath a gritty struggle. I bucked, twisting beneath him, my hands scrabbling for purchase on the dirt floor. I can't hurt him, I thought, even as his fingers dug into my neck, bruising the skin. He's still Papa, somewhere in there. The shed was a maelstrom. Now, the thresher's hum, joined by shouts. Workers, my father, their voices slicing through the chaos. I caught a glimpse of my dad's face, pale and drawn, as he sprinted across the shed, his work boots pounding the floor. Papa's grip tightened, his eyes wild, unseeing, reflecting the glint of the blades. "I won't let you," he bellowed, his voice breaking into a sob. I kicked out my foot, connecting with his shin, and he stumbled, giving me a split second to roll free. I scrambled to my feet, gasping my vision, swimming with dust and tears, my lungs burning with every breath. My father reached us, his arms wrapping around Papa, like a lifeline pulling him back. "Dad, stop!" he shouted, his voice thick with anguish, cracking under the weight of the moment. Papa thrashed his elbows, swinging, but my father held firm, his strength born of love and desperation. I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving, the world spinning like a carousel gone mad. The thresher's hum faded to a dull roar as a worker shut it down, the sudden silence deafening, broken only by Papa's ragged breaths and the soft thud of grain settling in the machine. I looked at Papa slumped in my father's arms, his face slack, his eyes vacant as a clouded sky. The rage was gone, replaced by a bewildered emptiness that carved a hole in my chest. "That's not Papa," I thought, a sob catching in my throat like a jagged stone. The man who'd taught me to tie sailor's knots, who'd laughed at my clumsy attempts to whistle, was slipping away, stolen by a sickness we hadn't seen creeping in. My father met my gaze, his eyes wet, his jaw tight with unspoken grief. "You okay, son?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper over the settling dust. I nodded, but it was a lie. I wasn't okay. I didn't know if I'd ever be again. The days that followed were a blur of quiet conversations and hospital visits. Papa was diagnosed with dementia, a cruel thief that had been lurking in the shadows of his mind, waiting for its moment to strike. The doctors said the outburst wasn't his fault, that the disease had twisted his memories, turned me into an enemy from a war long over. But their words didn't erase the terror of those moments, the feel of his hands on my throat, the thresher's blades gleaming like a guillotine, the dust that still lingered in my lungs. Papa was moved to a care facility, a sterile place of soft lights and locked doors where he'd be safe from himself and others. I tried to visit, but each time I saw him shuffling down a hallway, staring at walls, a stranger in his own skin, I saw the man from the shed, the one who'd looked at me with murder in his eyes. The farm changed after that day. The threshing sheds, once just part of the daily grind, became a haunted place in my mind. The machines were monsters, their hum a reminder of how close I'd come to being torn apart. I'd lie awake at night, the ceiling above my bed, a canvas for memories I couldn't shake. Papa's scream, the heat of the thresher, the moment I lifted him and felt his weight, both physical and emotional. My father grew quieter, his shoulders hunched with a guilt he never voiced, as if he should have seen the signs. My mother held us together, her hands steady as she cooked dinner or mended clothes, but I saw the fear in her eyes when she glanced toward the sheds, as if they might swallow us all. Years later, I heard a story that echoed mine, a whisper from a neighboring town that chilled me to the bone. An old farmer, sick like Papa, had wandered into a thresher shed at night, muttering about enemies and battles no one else could see. His family found him at dawn, the machine silent but stained with blood, his body broken beyond recognition. They said he'd been a kind man, a father, a grandfather, until his mind betrayed him. I wondered if he'd seen the same ghosts Papa did, if his final moments were a war against shadows only he could name. The thought haunted me, a reminder that the mind can be as deadly as any blade, as unforgiving as the machines we built to tame the land. I think of Papa often not as the stranger from that day, but as the man who'd sat with me by the creek, teaching me to skip stones across the water. I remember his laugh, rough but warm, and the way his eyes crinkled when I caught my first fish. Those memories are my anchor, holding me steady when the hum of the threshers creeps into my dreams. The farm is still my home, but it's marked by that moment, by the hunger of the machine and the fragility of the mind. The new threshers are sleeker, safer, but they can't erase the past. Every time I pass the sheds, I hear it, the ghost of the blades, calling me back to the day I almost lost everything, and the man I loved became a battlefield. It was a quiet night when the grain silo took my Uncle Rick, but the silence was a lie. The air on our family farm hung thick, oppressive like a storm, waiting to break. I was 16, then one of 6 siblings, running wild across the wheat fields, our laughter echoing under the endless sky. But that night, something shifted. The silo, that rusted metal giant squatting at the heart of our land, wasn't just a storage tower anymore. It was alive, hungry, and it had chosen Rick. I didn't know it then, but when I saw my little sister, Elth, staring out the kitchen window, her face pale as bone, a cold dread crawled into my chest, a dread that would cling to me for years, like dust I could never shake. Our farm wasn't some grand estate. It was a modest grain operation built by my grandparents' calloused hands and stubborn hearts. My father, the foreman, kept the place running, while my mother ruled our home with a will of iron. We kids grew up with the rhythm of the harvest, our days filled with the scent of earth and the hum of machinery. The silos were our landmarks, 3 squat cylinders of weathered steel that loomed over the fields like ancient guardians. They weren't tall or gleaming, but they had a presence, a weight that pressed against your ribs when you stood too close. As children, we'd dare each other to touch their scalding sides, giggling as we sprinted away blind to the danger coiled inside. Mother had rules about the silos, rules carved into us like scripture. You don't climb them. You don't go near them. You don't even stare too long, she'd say, her voice sharp with a fear she never named. She'd point at the silos, her eyes distant, and whisper, "If you fall in, you don't come out." I thought she meant the fall a long drop to a shattered end. I was wrong. The real danger wasn't the emptiness. It was the grain, millions of tiny kernels that could bury you alive, crushing your lungs until you were nothing but a shadow in the dark. Feel the weight of that truth. Picture yourself at the base of a silo, its shadow swallowing you whole. The silos weren't just machines. They were traps holding life and death in a cruel balance. I learned that the summer Rick disappeared, a summer that broke our family, and left scars we'd never outrun. Rick was my mother's brother-in-law, married to her younger sister. He was a pillar of the farm, a man in his 50s, with a laugh like rolling thunder, and hands that could mend anything: tractors, fences, even our broken toys. To us kids, he was Uncle Rick, the one who'd slip us extra cookies or spin tales of the farm's early days when wolves still haunted the fields. He was steady, unshakable, the kind of man you'd trust with your life. So when he didn't show up for work one morning, it was as if the world had tilted off its axis. That day began like any other. The air was heavy with the scent of cut wheat, and the drone of machinery filled the yard. I was hauling grain sacks with Dad when Mother noticed Rick's absence. "He's never late," she said, her voice tight, her eyes flicking toward the silos. Dad checked his watch, his brow creased, but said nothing. Work continued, but a nervous hum settled over the farm like the buzz of a wasp's nest. Mother kept pacing, her gaze returning to the silos, her lips pressed into a thin line. I thought it was just her usual worry, like the way she'd check the locks twice at night. I was wrong. It was Elf who shattered the quiet. My youngest sister, barely 10, was the silent one, always watching, with eyes too big for her small face. That afternoon, as we gathered in the kitchen, she spoke, her voice a fragile thread. "Uncle Rick was at the silo last night." The room froze. Mother turned her hands, clutching a dishcloth, her knuckles white. "What do you mean, Elf?" she asked, her tone sharp but trembling, like glass about to crack. Elf shifted her gaze, fixed on the floor. "I saw him. I got up for water, and he was out there on top of the big silo, in the moonlight." Her words hung heavy, like the heat pressing against the windows. Dad's face darkened. "You sure, sweetheart?" he asked, but his voice carried a tremor. Elf nodded, her small hands twisting together. "He was on the ladder. I saw him pause and see it. A lone figure on a silo's ladder, silhouetted against the night, the world holding its breath. It didn't add up. Rick lived in town, 20 minutes away. Why would he be at the farm in the dead of night? Mother's face drained of color, and she grabbed Dad's arm. "Check the silos," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Now, I followed Dad out, my heart hammering. The silos stood silent, their metal glinting dully in the afternoon sun. A handful of workers joined us, their faces grim tools clanking softly. I hung back, watching as Dad climbed the ladder to the hatch of the largest silo. The air felt wrong, thick, with a stillness that made my skin prickle. I glanced at the other silos, half expecting Rick's figure to appear, but there was only the endless stretch of fields, golden and indifferent. Dad's shout tore through the silence. "Get the ropes! Call the sheriff!" His voice was raw, panicked, in a way I'd never heard. My stomach twisted, and I ran closer, ignoring the workers' shouts to stay back. Dad was halfway down the ladder, his face gray as ash. "He's in there," he said, his voice a whisper. Rick's in the silo. The next hours blurred into chaos. Workers rigged ropes and pulleys, their movements frantic but precise. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies, their radios crackling like static in a storm. I stood at the edge of the yard, my eyes locked on the silo's hatch. Mother kept Elf inside, but I saw her shadow in the kitchen window, small and still watching. The workers lowered a man into the silo, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Time stretched each second heavy, with a dread I couldn't name. When they pulled Rick out, the world stopped. They laid him on a tarp, his body unnaturally still, his limbs bent at wrong angles. His face, his face, wasn't his anymore. The grain had ravaged him, pressing against his skin, until it looked bruised, swollen, unrecognizable. His eyes stared blankly wide and empty, and his mouth was packed with wheat kernels spilling out like a grotesque offering. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were rooted to the earth. The workers turned away, some muttering prayers, others crossing themselves. The sheriff said something about grain entrapment, but his words drowned in the roar in my head. Close your eyes and see it. A man you loved, reduced to a husk, the grain claiming him as its own. I couldn't look away. Rick's hands were clenched, as if he'd fought until the end. His clothes were torn, soaked with sweat, and dust clinging to his frame like a second skin. The air reeked of earth and death, a sickly sweetness that coated my throat. One deputy knelt beside him, shaking his head. He suffocated. He said, his voice low, slow. Must have taken hours. The word struck like a blade. Rick, alone in the dark, sinking deeper into the grain. Each breath a struggle, each moment a step closer to oblivion. I pictured him clawing at the silo's walls, his screams swallowed by the weight of the wheat. Had he known it was coming? Had he chosen it? The thought was too vast, too heavy, and I shoved it away, focusing on the tarp, the dust anything but the truth. Dad climbed down from the silo, clutching something in his trembling hands. Rick's boots neatly placed, his jacket folded with care, his watch, its face cracked, but still ticking, counting seconds that no longer mattered. They'd been left on the ledge, just inside the hatch. A message, a farewell, a puzzle we'd never solve. Dad handed them to the sheriff, his eyes distant, his shoulders slumped. He did this, he said, his voice hollow. He climbed up there and stepped off. Mother didn't cry. Not then. She stood at the edge of the tarp, arms crossed her face, a mask of stone. But I saw her hands tremble, saw the way her eyes lingered on Rick's body, tracing the lines of a man she'd known for decades. She'd always feared the silos had warned us of their hunger. Now they'd taken someone she loved, and the weight of that truth settled over her like a shroud. The days that followed were gray, lifeless. The farm kept running silos. Don't care about grief, but nothing felt right. I couldn't walk past the big silo without feeling its pull, a cold whisper that seemed to know my name. At night, I'd lie awake, replaying Rick's final moments, the grain sliding over his skin, filling his lungs, stealing his breath. In my dreams, I saw his face, his eyes accusing his mouth, moving to form words I couldn't hear. Sometimes I'd wake gasping, my chest tight, as if the grain had found me too. Elith stopped talking for weeks. She'd sit by the kitchen window, staring at the silos, as if waiting for Rick to climb back down. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have known, but the words lodged in my throat like stones. Mother burned Rick's clothes in the backyard, the smoke curling into the sky like a prayer unanswered. Dad worked longer hours, his laughter gone, his shoulders bent under a weight I couldn't see. We never knew why Rick did it. No note, no explanation. The sheriff called it a mental health issue, something undiagnosed, but that felt too small, too tidy. Rick had been happy, hadn't he? He'd laughed with us, worked with us, lived with us. But maybe there were cracks we'd missed, shadows he'd kept hidden. Maybe the silo had called to him its hunger, too strong to resist. I read about grain entrapment later, about the dozens of deaths each year, workers swallowed by the crops they harvested. The numbers were cold clinical, but they couldn't capture the terror, the slow, suffocating descent, the knowledge that no one could save you. Mother's rules grew stricter after Rick's death. We weren't allowed within 50 yards of the silos, not even to play. She'd stand at the kitchen window, watching them, like they might move, might reach out and take another of us. I caught her once, late at night, whispering to herself, her hands pressed against the glass. "You won't have them," she said, her voice fierce, defiant. "Not my children." I never asked who she was talking to, but I felt it the silo, listening, waiting. The farm was never the same. We sold it a few years later when the market turned and the silos became too costly to maintain. I was glad to leave, to escape the weight of that place. But Rick's memory stayed with me. I can still see his body on that tarp, the grain spilling from his mouth. I can still hear the silo's silence, a silence that wasn't empty, but full brimming with something ancient and cruel. And now you carry it too. The weight of the silo, the hunger of the grain. It's been 15 years, but I haven't forgotten. The silos are gone, sold, or torn down, but they live in me, in the nightmares that wake me at dawn, in the way I flinch at the smell of wheat. Rick's watch sits in a drawer, its hands frozen at the moment he left us. Sometimes I hold it, feeling its weight, wondering if he's still out there, trapped in the dark, waiting for someone to pull him free. But the silo doesn't let go. It never does. The years haven't dulled the memory of that summer. I left the farm, moved to the city, built a life far from the fields. But the silo follows me. It's in the way I avoid tight spaces, the way my chest tightens in crowded rooms. It's in the stories I tell my own children, warnings disguised as fairy tales about monsters that live in quiet places. I don't tell them about Rick. Not yet. They're too young to carry that weight. But someday I will, because they need to know not just about the danger, but about the fragility of the people we love, the way they can slip away without warning. I went back to the farm once, years after we sold it. The new owners had torn down the silos, replaced them with sleek, modern storage units. The fields were still there, golden and endless, but the air felt lighter, like a curse had been lifted. I walked to where the big silo once stood, now just a patch of bare earth. I half expected to feel something Rick's presence, maybe, or the silo's hunger. But there was nothing, just the wind rustling the wheat, carrying the scent of dust and memory. Still, I knelt and pressed my hand to the ground, as if I could reach through the years and pull Rick back. I whispered his name, soft enough that only the earth could hear. I don't know if he heard me, wherever he is. I don't know if he's free, but I know the silo took more than his life. It took a piece of us all. Mother's strength, Dad's laughter, Elth's voice, my innocence. It left us hollow, like the empty husks of grain scattered across the fields. Look at your hands now. Can you feel the dust, the weight of the grain? It's not just a story, it's a warning. The world is full of quiet places, places that seem safe until they're not, places that hunger for something you can't see until it's too late. Rick learned that, and so did we. The silo is gone, but its shadow remains stretching across the years, waiting for the next soul to claim. The rain didn't just fall, it slashed at my face, each drop a cold blade cutting through my skin, reminding me I was utterly alone. That bleak afternoon, the Swedish countryside sprawled before me like a forgotten graveyard, its fields drenched in gray, its gnarled trees clawing at a sky that seemed to choke on its own despair. Our family's sheep farm, tucked away in a desolate corner of the world, was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where the soft bleats of our rare breed of sheep wove a thread of peace through generations. Their wool, prized for its silken texture, coveted by artisans across Europe, was our pride, our lifeblood. But on that day, the farm felt like a trap, its isolation a silent beckoning for something sinister to creep in from the shadows. I was on shepherd duty, a task I'd known since I was old enough to walk these fields. My only companion was Bruno, our farm dog, his black and white fur slick with drizzle, his amber eyes darting across the horizon as if he sensed a threat I couldn't yet see. The 10 sheep in our herd grazed sluggishly, their wool heavy with moisture, their breaths puffing into the cold air like faint ghosts. I leaned against an ancient oak, its rough bark biting into my back, and scrolled through my phone. The screen's dim glow, a weak shield against the dread coiling in my gut. This place was too quiet, not the gentle hush of nature, but a predatory silence, the kind that hides a scream just before it tears free. As a boy, I'd followed my grandfather across these same fields, his weathered hands gripping a staff, his voice low as he spun tales of the land. He'd point to the horizon, his eyes distant, and say, "This farm is our blood, our soul." But blood draws wolves, men with no honor, no heart. They'll come for what's ours, and when they do, you fight. You fight like the devil himself. I'd nod, half listening, thinking his stories were just the ramblings of an old man. But now those words clawed at me sharp and urgent, a warning I'd dismissed too long. The memory of his voice, rough as the wind, stirred something deep inside a flicker of resolve beneath the fear. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet wool and rotting leaves. The rain a relentless drumbeat against my hood. Bruno's fur was warm under my fingers, his heartbeat a faint pulse against my palm, grounding me as my unease grew. I tried to focus on my phone, but the silence pressed harder, a weight on my chest. Then it came a sound that shattered the stillness like a gunshot, a low guttural rumble, the growl of an engine alien, and wrong in this forgotten place. My head snapped up, my heart slamming against my ribs. A vehicle. Out here, where the nearest neighbor was miles away, the sound was a violation, a scream in a sacred hall. I crouched behind the oak, my breath shallow, and peered through the dripping branches. A truck, its paint chipped and rusted, lurched toward the gate at the edge of the field. The engine's roar was a wound in the quiet, each rev a stab to my nerves. Nobody comes here. Nobody. My fingers clamped around Bruno's collar, his body rigid, a low whine escaping his throat. I pressed my hand to his muzzle, my own pulse thundering in my ears. Stay quiet, boy. The truck stopped, and two men stepped out. One was short and wiry, his movements jerky, like a puppet with broken strings. The other was broader, his shoulders hunched, his presence heavy, like a storm cloud given flesh. Their dark jackets and low hoods hid their faces, but I caught a glimpse, hard hollow eyes, the kind that belonged to men who'd traded their souls for survival. The wiry one opened the gate, his motions precise, predatory. The broader one scanned the field, his gaze sweeping like a hunter's. I ducked lower, the damp earth soaking my knees, my heart racing. Sheep rustlers. The term felt absurd, like something from an old Western tale, but their intent was unmistakable. These weren't lost travelers or curious locals. They were here to steal our lifeblood, to rip away what my family had built over decades. The thought hit me like a blow. Our sheep were worth a fortune, each one a piece of our legacy. Losing even one would cripple us, not just financially, but in our hearts. I'd raised these sheep, bottle-fed them, as lambs, felt their warmth as I sheared their wool. They were family. The idea of these strangers touching them, hurting them, was a violation I couldn't bear. Years ago, a fox had slipped into our barn, its eyes glinting in the dark blood on its muzzle. I was 12, woken by the sheep's frantic bleats. My father grabbed his rifle, his face grim, and I followed, clutching a flashlight. We found the fox, and my father's shot echoed through the night. Sometimes, he said later, wiping the barrel, you have to be the predator to protect what's yours. That lesson, buried for years, surged back now and fierce. I had to be the predator, not the prey. The wiry one lunged at a ewe, her bleat sharp. and panicked as she skittered away, hooves churning mud. The broader one cursed his voice, a low growl carrying across the field. They were clumsy, untrained, but their desperation was a living thing, a hunger that made them dangerous. A desperate man is a reckless one, and reckless men don't care who they hurt. The rain stung my face, each drop a needle piercing my skin. The air reeked of mud wool, and fear my own, and the sheep's. Bruno's warmth was my only anchor, his fur slick under my trembling hands. The truck's engine idled a constant growl, vibrating in my chest, blending with the distant bleats of the herd. Every sound, every sensation was a scream urging me to act. But fear rooted me, my mind spiraling. I was no fighter, just a skinny shepherd in his 20s, my hands more at home with a crook than a weapon. What could I do against two of them? Then my mother's voice cut through sharp and commanding from a memory of me sneaking into the barn as a boy. You protect what's yours, no matter the cost. Her words were a spark, igniting defiance in my chest, burning away the fear. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the farmhouse. Dad. I whispered my voice, barely audible over the rain. Men are here, trying to steal the sheep. Call the police. Now. I hung up before he could reply, shoving the phone into the bushes. I couldn't risk it breaking or them finding it. Bruno whined, his eyes locked on the men, his body quivering with the urge to charge. I tied his leash to a low branch, my fingers slipping on the wet rope. Stay here, boy, I murmured, my voice cracking. Be a good boy. He tilted his head, confused, but stayed. I couldn't let him get hurt. Not Bruno, who'd slept at the foot of my bed since he was a pup, who'd followed me through every storm. I broke off a thick branch from the oak, its weight solid grounding. It wasn't a weapon, not really, but it was all I had. My plan was desperate, reckless, scare them off, make them think I was crazier, more dangerous than they were. I took a deep breath, the cold air searing my lungs, and stepped out from behind the tree. You will run. You will leave this place and never return. I charged across the field, the branch raised high, my voice erupting in a primal scream. Get off my land. I'll kill you. I'll tear your throats out. The words were a torrent, raw and unhinged, a spell to banish evil. The men froze their heads, snapping toward me. The wiry one stumbled, his eyes wide with shock. The broader one reached for his waistband, and time stopped. No. Oh God, no. He pulled out a pistol, its barrel glinting dully in the gray light. A gun. They have a gun. My legs buckled, the branch slipping from my hands and hitting the mud with a dull thud. I stood there, exposed, the rain plastering my hair to my face, my chest heaving. The wiry one smirked his confidence, returning, while the broader one kept the gun trained on me. "Stay where you are," he growled, his voice thick, with an accent I couldn't place. "Don't play hero." The gun was everything, a black void, swallowing my courage, my hope. I saw my mother's face, tear-streaked, mourning me. I saw my father, his rifle lowered, unable to save me. I saw the sheep, their eyes wide with panic. I'm going to die. The thought was calm, almost serene, like sinking into a frozen lake. Then a laugh burst from me, absurd, unbidden. I was laughing at the madness of it all. Me, a shepherd, facing armed thieves with a stick. The wiry one flinched, unnerved. "What's so funny?" he snapped, stepping closer. "Nothing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're not as smart as you think." It was a bluff, a desperate grasp for control. The broader one tightened his grip on the gun, his eyes narrowing. He nodded to his partner, who moved toward me, hands outstretched to pat me down. I stood still, my mind racing. They don't know about the phone. The police are coming. I clung to that thought, a fragile lifeline. The wiry one's hands were rough, his breath sour, reeking of cheap tobacco and stale beer. He found nothing and stepped back confused. "He's clean," he muttered. The broader one grunted, then grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh like claws. On the ground, he ordered, shoving me down. This is it, I thought. They'll kill me, take the sheep, vanish. But something snapped, a spark of rage, fueled by the sheep, my family, this land. No, not today. Time slowed, the world shrinking to the gun, the man, the rain. My grandfather's warning echoed. Bruno's pleading eyes flashed the sheep's vulnerability, burned. I saw myself not as prey, but as a guardian. You will not win. With a roar, I lunged at the broader one, my shoulder slamming into his chest. He staggered, the gun flying from his hand, skittering across the mud. It felt light, too light. A toy. A BB gun. The realization was a jolt, but there was no time to think. The wiry one tackled me, his fists slamming into my ribs. Pain exploded the world, spinning as we hit the ground. The broader one joined his boots, connecting with my side. I curled up, gasping, my vision blurring. I can't fight them both. But then a sound cut through the chaos, a feral snarl, raw and unstoppable. Bruno. He'd broken free, his leash snapping, and now he was charging a storm of teeth and fury. The men froze their eyes, with terror. Bruno's barks were thunder, each one a vow of violence. He lunged at the wiry one, who screamed and stumbled back. The broader one scrambled for the truck, shouting incoherently. I dragged myself to my knees, pain screaming through me, and watched Bruno chase them across the field. The sheep scattered their bleats, a frantic symphony, but none were harmed. The men reached the truck, the engine roaring as they peeled away tires, spitting mud. Bruno stopped at the gate, his hackles raised, his barks echoing into the dusk. I collapsed, the rain washing away blood and sweat. Bruno trotted back, his tongue lapping my cheek. I wrapped my arms around him, sobbing, my chest heaving. We did it. We saved them. But the victory was hollow. The gun's image, real or not, was burned into my mind. The men's faces, their voices, the pain of their blows, it was too real, too close. That night, I sat with my father by the fire, the same fire where my grandfather spun his tales. You did what you had to, Dad said, his voice heavy. But it cost you. He was right. The farm, once my sanctuary, became a prison. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a warning. I saw the gun in my dreams, felt the fists, heard Bruno's barks. The police arrived hours later, their lights slicing through the dusk, their voices distant as they questioned me. The cousins, local troublemakers, as I'd suspected, were caught in a nearby town. The gun was a BB gun, a cruel joke, but its shadow lingered. I'd lie awake, the rain's patter on my window, morphing into footsteps, the wind's howl into Bruno's barks. I'd see the sheep, their eyes pleading, and feel the mud under my nails, the pain in my ribs. The farm, once alive, with memories of my grandfather's stories, my mother's lessons, became a ghost haunting me, with what I'd lost, not just safety, but myself. Months later, I left trading fields for a city desk where dangers were mundane. But the farm never left me. The rain, the gun, Bruno's loyalty, there's scars on my soul. Proof that safety is a lie and some battles break you even when you win. The aftermath was a fog, a blur of sleepless nights and haunted days. I'd walk the fields, checking the sheep, but every rustle made me flinch. Every shadow, a figure with a gun. Bruno stayed close, his presence a comfort, but even he couldn't chase away the fear. I'd sit by the gate where the truck had stood, staring at the tire tracks, now faded, and wonder how close I'd come to dying. The cousins' faces haunted me. The wiry one's smirk, the broader ones, cold stare. I'd hear their voices, their curses, their threats, as if they were still there, waiting. The sheep, once a source of pride, became a reminder of that day, their bleats echoing the panic I'd felt. I'd shear their wool, my hands steady, but my heart racing, expecting a shadow to move a hand to grab me. Leaving the farm was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I packed a single bag, hugged Bruno one last time, and drove away, the fields shrinking in my rearview mirror. The city was loud, chaotic, but safe, or so I told myself. I found a job, a desk, a routine, but the farm clung to me. I'd wake in the night, gasping the gun's barrel, staring me down. I'd hear Bruno's barks, feel the rain, taste the mud. The scars weren't visible, but they were there, etched into my soul. I'd think of my grandfather, his warnings, and wonder if he'd known how deep the cost would be. I'd think of my mother, her fierce love, and wish I could be the protector she'd raised. But most of all, I'd think of Bruno, his loyalty, my salvation, and know that some battles, even when won, leave you broken. The rain didn't just fall. It slithered cold and relentless, seeping through my skin, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I'd always loved the Somerset orchard, its endless rows of apple trees stretching like guardians across the countryside. It was my refuge, a place where the world's noise faded, leaving only the crunch of my boots and the joyful bounds of my Labrador Ben. But that afternoon, as the mist curled like skeletal fingers around the gnarled trunks, the orchard turned against me. Something was watching something that knew my name, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The public footpath through the orchard was my ritual, a thread woven into the fabric of my life. I'd walked it in every season, spring's blossom storms, summer's golden haze, autumn's fiery decay. But today, winter's grip held tight, the sky a bruised gray, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. My boots sank into the mud, each step a soft squelch that echoed in the silence. Ben trotted ahead, his golden fur matted with drizzle, his tail a metronome of joy. He hadn't sensed it yet, but I had a weight in the air, like the orchard was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice. I pulled my hood tighter, the rain stinging my cheeks. The trees loomed, their branches twisting into shapes that seemed alive, watchful. I'd never felt alone here before. Not really. Even on quiet days, the orchard hummed with life birds, flitting squirrels scurrying the distant bark of another dog. But today, it was different. The silence was oppressive, a living thing that pressed against my eardrums, broken only by the drip of water from leaves. Ben paused, sniffing a fallen apple, and I called to him, my voice flat, swallowed by the mist. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement just beyond the next row. My heart lurched, a primal instinct kicking in before my mind could catch up. It was nothing, I told myself. A trick of the light, a branch swaying in the wind. But Ben's ears perked, his body stiffening, and I knew he'd seen it, too. I clipped his leash to his collar, my fingers clumsy in the cold, and murmured, "Stay close, Ben." My voice trembled, betraying the fear I didn't want to name. The movement came again, deliberate, a shadow, slipping between two trees, maybe 60 yards away. It was a man, tall and lean, draped in a long, dark coat that seemed to drink the dim light. His face was hidden, but his posture was wrong, too. Still, too predatory, like a wolf sizing up a lamb. I turned left, quickening my pace, pretending I hadn't seen him. The orchard's rows stretched endlessly, the trees closing in their branches, clawing at the sky. The mist thickened, blurring the world, until it was just me, Ben, and the path ahead. But the prickle on my neck turned into a blade, sharp and cold, digging deeper with every step. I glanced over my shoulder, praying for nothing, dreading everything. He was there, closer now, his coat flapping like a vulture's wings. How had he moved so fast? My breath caught a small sound in the vast silence, and I broke into a jog, Ben's leash taut in my hand. The orchard was no longer my sanctuary. It was a maze, each turn leading me deeper into its heart, each tree a silent conspirator. Ben whined his eyes, darting to the side, and I followed his gaze. He was there again, stepping out from behind a tree, closer still. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet jerked by invisible strings. The mist hid his face, but I felt his eyes boring into me, stripping away my defenses. My chest tightened, my pulse a frantic drumbeat. I veered right, hoping to lose him, but the orchard seemed to shift, the rows twisting the mist, swallowing landmarks I'd known for years. He was following me. The truth hit like a fist, stealing my breath. My jog became a run, my boots slipping in the mud, Ben's claws scrabbling beside me. The rain hissed, the branches groaned, and behind me, footsteps thudded, slow, deliberate, relentless. I ducked under a low branch, my hood catching and yanking back, exposing my face to the stinging drizzle. The exit stile was out there, somewhere beyond the mist, but the orchard stretched on endless, suffocating. Had it always been this vast? My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I couldn't stop. Ben barked sharp and frantic, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. I stumbled my foot, catching on a root, and for a moment, I thought I'd fall. Ben yanked at the leash, urging me forward, and I caught myself against a tree, its bark rough and cold under my palms. I spun around my back to the trunk, searching the mist for him. He was gone. The orchard was still, the footsteps silent, the air thick, with an unnatural quiet. But the relief was a lie, poisoned by the certainty that he was still there, watching, waiting. I crouched low, peering through the trunks, hoping to catch a glimpse of his coat, his shadow. Nothing. Ben growled low and guttural, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Then he spoke, not from behind, not from the side, but ahead, his voice cutting through the mist like a blade. "You shouldn't be here," he said the words, low guttural, not entirely human. My blood turned to ice, my body frozen, every instinct screaming to run, but my legs refusing to move. He stepped out from between two trees, closer now, too close, his coat parting to reveal the grotesque truth. He wasn't wearing pants. The sight was absurd, obscene, but it was his eyes that terrified me, empty, hollow, like pits carved into his skull, reflecting nothing but darkness. I screamed the sound, raw and desperate, and bolted. Ben ran with me, his leash snapping taut as we tore through the orchard. The trees blurred their branches, clawing at my arms, my face. The mist choked me, filling my lungs with its damp, suffocating weight. Behind me, his footsteps pounded faster, now closer. He was gaining. I could feel his presence, a malevolent force, pressing against my back, urging me to falter, to fall. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. The stile was there, just beyond the next row, its wooden planks, a beacon in the fog. Let me tell you about my grandmother. She used to walk this orchard too, years ago when the trees were younger, the path less worn. She'd told me stories, half forgotten, tales of a man who haunted these rows, a figure in a long coat who appeared on rainy days, watching, waiting. "He's not a man," she'd whispered, her eyes distant, not anymore. I'd laughed it off, chalking it up to old age, to the whimsy of a mind softened by time. But now, as I ran, her words echoed sharp and real. Was this him? The thing she'd seen, the thing that had followed her too. The orchard seemed to pulse the trees, leaning closer, their roots rising to trip me. I tripped over a gnarled root, my knee slamming into the mud, pain shooting through my leg. Ben whined, nudging me his warmth a fleeting comfort. I scrambled to my feet, my hands slick with mud, and kept running. The stile was closer now, its outline sharp against the mist. I could make it. I had to. But his voice came again, closer, impossibly close, a whisper in my ear. "You can't leave," he said, and I swore I felt his breath, cold and rank, against my neck. I reached the stile, my hand scrabbling at its rough surface. Ben scrambled under his leash, tangling in my legs, but I didn't care. I climbed my boots, slipping my heart, hammering so loud I thought it would burst. I glanced back, expecting to see him lunging for me, his hands reaching his eyes, boring into mine. But he was farther back, standing among the trees, motionless, his coat flapping in the wind. He was watching, not chasing. The realization was worse somehow than the pursuit. He knew I'd escape, and he didn't care. This wasn't about catching me, not yet. I stumbled into the open field, the mist thinning, the world expanding. My car was there, 200 yards away, its red paint a lifeline in the gray. I sprinted Ben at my side, my breath ragged, my legs trembling. The field was wide exposed, but it felt safer than the orchard's suffocating embrace. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. I threw open the car door, shoving Ben inside, and locked it behind us. My phone was in the glove compartment, its screen a faint glow in the dimness. I dialed the police, my voice barely recognizable. "There's a man in the orchard," I gasped. "He's following me. He's not right." The officer's voice was calm, infuriatingly so. "We've had reports of a flasher in the area," he said. "Can you describe him?" I tried, but the words caught in my throat. How do you describe a man who isn't a man? How do you explain a voice that crawls inside your skull? A presence that feels older than the trees? I gave what details I could. Tall, long coat, no pants, eyes like voids. They promised to send someone, but I knew they wouldn't find him. He was part of the orchard, now woven into its roots, its shadows. I drove home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Ben curled up in the passenger seat, his warmth the only thing keeping me grounded. But the orchard followed me. Its mist clung to my skin. Its trees loomed in my mind. That night, I dreamed of him. He stood at the edge of my garden, his coat flapping, his eyes empty. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to return, to step back into the orchard, to become part of its darkness. Days passed, but the fear didn't fade. I stopped walking Ben in the orchard, choosing safer, busier paths instead. But the memory of that day lingered a splinter in my mind. The police called a week later, asking me to come to a lineup in the neighboring town. I went, my stomach churning. Ben's leash clutched in my hand as I left him in the car. The lineup was a blur of faces, but I knew him the moment I saw him. Those eyes, those hollow, hungry eyes. He wore a cheap suit, now ill-fitting and stained, but it was him. I pointed him out, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. But the other women, the ones he'd flashed before, couldn't agree. Some picked different men. Some didn't pick anyone. The police let him go. Their apologies, hollow. Their promises, empty. I saw him again, months later in town. He was outside the library, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his coat draped over his arm. My son, who'd been with me that day, recognized him, too. "That's the man, Mum." He whispered, his voice tight with fear. The library's alarm blared as he tried to leave books tumbling from his bag. He tossed them onto the desk and fled, his coat flapping like wings. No one stopped him. No one ever did. But it wasn't just him I saw. The orchard itself began to haunt me. I'd catch glimpses of it in places it couldn't be a row of twisted trees at the edge of a park, a flicker of mist in my rearview mirror. I'd hear his voice, that guttural whisper in the quiet of the night. "You can't leave." I started locking my doors, twice checking the windows, keeping Ben closer than ever. He sensed it, too, his once joyful bounds replaced by a wary alertness, his eyes scanning the shadows. Let me tell you about the story I found. Months after the incident, I was clearing out my grandmother's attic, sorting through boxes of yellowed papers and faded photographs. Tucked inside an old journal, I found a newspaper clipping, brittle and brown with age. It was from 1953, a small article about a man who'd vanished in the orchard. He'd been a drifter, the article said, known for lurking among the trees, watching women as they walked. One day, he was gone, leaving only his coat found draped over a branch. The locals whispered he'd been taken by the orchard, claimed by something older, hungrier. My grandmother had circled the article in red ink, her handwriting scrawled in the margin. "He's still there." I burned the clipping that night, watching the flames curl around the words. But it didn't help. The orchard was inside me now, a wound that wouldn't heal. I moved away from Somerset a year later, hoping distance would dull the fear. It didn't. I still dream of the trees, their branches reaching their roots, whispering my name. I still see his eyes, staring from the darkness, waiting for me to return. And sometimes, when the rain falls and the world grows quiet, I hear his voice, soft and inevitable. "You shouldn't be here," he says, and I know he's right. The air shattered with a bellow, that clawed at my soul, a sound not of this world, raw, guttural, as if the earth itself was tearing open to unleash its rage. I stood, frozen, my boots sinking into the sodden ground as the horizon erupted into chaos. Dozens of beasts, their eyes black voids piercing the mist, charged toward us, hooves slashing the earth like scythes. They weren't just running, they were hunting. My husband's grip tightened on my arm, his voice a desperate rasp. They're coming. Move. The morning had begun with a deceptive calm, the kind of peace you'd frame in a memory and hang on the wall. It was a cool July day, the sky over the English countryside, a heavy gray promising rain, but holding it back. My husband and I had walked this public footpath for years, a winding trail that cut through rolling fields and ancient hedgerows, its familiarity a balm to our restless lives. Our 2 dogs led the way, the older one a weathered mutt with a scar across her flank from a long-forgotten fight, moved with a steady, cautious gait. The puppy, all gangly legs and boundless joy, darted ahead, her yips echoing off the stone walls. We called them our girls, our companions in this quiet ritual. That day, the world felt safe, a sanctuary carved from routine, but the field felt different the moment we crossed the stile, its wood slick with dew groaning under our weight. This was the same stretch where sheep once grazed their soft bleats, a gentle soundtrack to our walks. Now, cows dominated the landscape, dozens of them, their massive forms scattered across the far end, half a mile distant. Their heads were lowered jaws, working at the grass tails, swatting lazily at flies. I barely spared them a glance. Cows were fixtures, weren't they? Placid, slow-witted beasts that posed no threat, their presence as ordinary as the breeze. Or so I told myself, yet something was wrong. The air carried a weight, a damp chill that seeped into my bones. The older dog pressed close, her hackles, bristling, her eyes scanning the horizon with a wariness I'd never seen. The puppy, oblivious, splashed into the shallow river, chasing a stick my husband tossed with a laugh. "She's a live wire," he said, his voice light, but his gaze lingered on the cows, a frown creasing his brow. "They're too still," he murmured, almost to himself. I looked again. The cows weren't grazing anymore. They stood, rigid heads raised, their dark eyes locked on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Not a blink, not a twitch, just a stare that felt alive, predatory. My stomach churned, a cold dread pooling inside. "They're just curious," I said, but the words felt hollow, a flimsy shield against the unease creeping up my spine. There were too many, 40, 50, their silhouettes stark against the gray sky. Some were smaller, their horns mere stubs. Young bulls. I realized, my heart stuttering. Not yet mature, but wild, their energy a coiled spring, ready to snap. Have you ever felt the world turn against you? Not a storm or a fall, but a slow, sickening shift, as if the ground itself had grown eyes and teeth. That's what I felt as the largest cow stepped forward. It towered over the others, its shoulders broad and muscled, its head lowered like a battering ram. Its eyes gleamed, not with the dullness of cattle, but with a cold, deliberate intent, a hunger that wasn't for grass. The herd moved with it. Their steps synchronized their hooves, stirring the earth into a faint tremor. A low rumble began a vibration that crawled up my legs and lodged in my chest. "They're coming," my husband said, his voice sharp now. He yanked the puppy back from the river, her wet fur dripping onto my hands. The older dog growled a deep, guttural sound that raised the hairs on my neck. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but the words died as the cows broke into a trot. The ground shook harder, a rhythmic thud that matched the pounding in my ears. The young bulls surged ahead, their compact bodies lean and lethal, their eyes fixed on us with a focus that chilled my blood. And then they charged. The largest cow led its bellow, a thunderclap that split the air, and the herd followed a tidal wave of muscle and bone. The earth trembled violently, clods of mud flying the air thick with the acrid stench of sweat and torn grass. My husband's hand clamped onto mine, his grip bruising. "Run!" he shouted, and we bolted the dogs, scrambling beside us. "Run!" The word burned in my mind, a desperate chant driving my legs forward. My boots slid on the wet grass, my lungs searing with each breath. The older dog kept pace, her ears flat, her tail tucked. The puppy whimpered in my arms, her claws digging into my skin. My husband was a step behind his shouts, lost in the roar of the stampede. The cows were closer now, their heat a palpable force, their weight a promise of obliteration. I could feel them, sense their mass, their relentless hunger, as if the field had awakened to claim us. I glanced back a mistake that seared itself into my memory. The young bulls were at the front, their horns glinting like daggers, their mouths frothing, their eyes empty yet piercing. Behind them, the larger cows loomed, their massive bodies swaying their bellows, merging into a single, unearthly wail. The ground churned beneath them, a sea of mud and grass, and for a fleeting second, I saw it, a shadow among them, tall and thin, its form wavering like heat over a flame. It wasn't a cow, wasn't anything I could name, its edges blurring into the mist. I blinked, and it was gone. But the terror it left behind was real. A cold spike in my gut. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, the puppy slipping in my grasp. My husband's arm hooked around me, hauling me upright. "Keep going!" He yelled, his face ashen, his eyes wild with determination. The gate to the next field loomed ahead, a wooden frame a quarter-mile away, but the cows were gaining their bellows, a deafening chorus, their hooves a relentless drumbeat. The older dog faltered her age, slowing her breaths coming in gasps. I wanted to scoop her up to save her, but the puppy was a burden, my arms aching. My husband saw it, his jaw clenching. Then he did the unthinkable. He stopped. He stopped. I screamed his name, my voice raw, but he waved me off, his eyes locked on the herd. "Get to the gate," he roared, and before I could protest, he turned to face them. He faced them. Arms spread wide, he shouted his voice, a defiant bellow. "Come on, take me instead." The young bulls veered toward him, their heads lowering their hooves, tearing the earth. He was baiting them, drawing their fury, buying us time. The older dog hesitated, glancing back, but I grabbed her collar, dragging her toward the gate. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the world, but I ran the puppy's whimpers, a knife in my heart, the ground shaking beneath me. My heart splintered, but I reached the gate, scrambling over the stile, my hands slipping on the wet wood. The older dog crawled under her fur, caked with mud. I set the puppy down, my arms trembling, and turned back, expecting to see my husband, crushed his body, lost to the herd. But he was still there, backing toward the river, his arms still raised. The cows slowed their charge, faltering as they neared the water's edge. The young bulls snorted, pawing the ground, their eyes still fixed on him. My husband waded into the river, the current tugging at his legs, then his waist. The cows reached the bank, their bellows fading, their movements disjointed, as if the force driving them had dissipated. They milled about, some turning away others, staring blankly, their hunger sated or abandoned. I collapsed against the gate, my legs giving out my breath, a series of ragged sobs. The older dog pressed against me, her warmth a faint anchor. The puppy yipped, confused, but alive. My husband staggered along the riverbank, his steps slow, his clothes soaked and torn. He climbed over the gate and pulled me into his arms, his breath hot against my neck, his hands shaking. "We're okay," he whispered, but his voice cracked, a lie we both felt. That field was no longer just a field. It had become a crucible, a place where the world shed its mask and revealed its teeth. We never returned, not even when the cows were gone, replaced by sheep, or left barren. The memory of those eyes, black hollow, ravenous, haunted my every step. The sound of those hooves, that earth-shaking thunder, echoed in my dreams, waking me in the dead of night, my heart a frantic drum. And that shadow, what was it? A trick of fear, or something ancient, something that had waited in that field, biding its time. The aftermath was a slow unraveling. We drove home in silence, the car's hum, a poor shield against the weight pressing on us. My husband's hands gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw locked in a way I'd never seen. The dogs lay still on the back seat, the older one panting softly, the puppy whimpering as if she too carried the memory. I stared out the window, the fields blurring past, but all I saw were those eyes, those hooves, that shadow flickering at the edge of my vision. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay tangled in sheets, listening to my husband's uneven breaths. Every creak of the house a threat. When I closed my eyes, the herd returned their charge, their wail, that shadow, weaving through them. Was it real, or had terror sculpted it from my mind? The question gnawed at me, a persistent ache. I rose my feet, cold on the floor, and made tea in the kitchen, the steam curling like the mists over that field. My husband found me there, his silhouette in the doorway, his eyes hollow. "Can't sleep?" he asked, and I shook my head. We sat at the table, the tea growing cold, and he spoke of things he'd kept buried. When I faced them, he said, his fingers tracing the wood, I thought I was done. Their eyes, they weren't cow eyes. They were alive, like they knew me. And that shadow you saw it too, didn't you? I nodded, my throat tight, and saw fear in him for the first time, raw and unguarded. The next day, driven by a need I couldn't name, I returned to the village near the field, leaving the dogs behind. The local pub was a relic. Its windows fogged its air thick with beer and smoke. I asked the bartender, a man with hands like gnarled roots about the field. His face darkened, and he leaned close. "That land's ancient," he said, his voice a whisper, "older than the village. They say things walk there, things that don't take kindly to strangers. Cows go mad sometimes, like they're taken over." He shared a tale, a fragment of folklore. Decades ago, a farmer vanished from that field, his cattle found, roaming. Wild, their eyes blackened, their mouths encrusted with mud. No body, but villagers swore they heard his cries in the wind. Some call it the land's hunger, the bartender murmured. Others, the old stones, buried deep, cursed by something we can't fathom. I left with a chill. His words, a weight I couldn't shake. At home, I delved into records unearthing mentions of the field in faded archives, a place shunned by shepherds where livestock turned violent without cause. One entry spoke of a hollow herd, cows driven by an unseen presence, feeding on fear. The shadow in my memory sharpened its form, no longer a trick, but a threat. Weeks bled into months, but the nightmares persisted. I'd wake to hooves to thunder, to my husband's voice urging me to run. The dogs grew skittish, the older one whining, the puppy hiding under tables. My husband avoided the outdoors, his once bold stride now a cautious shuffle. We tried to rebuild, to bury the past, but it clung like a second skin, and then it returned. One dusk, as violet stained the sky, a rumble broke the silence, distant but unmistakable. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, and saw an empty street. The sound grew rattling the glass, and my husband joined me, his face drained. "It's them," he whispered, grabbing a flashlight. We stepped outside, the dogs growling, their fur bristling. The air thickened heavy with that same prickle. The rumble neared, and I turned to see shapes tall, wavering. Not cows, but something else. The shadow led them, its head tilted, its faceless void staring. My husband raised the flashlight, its beam cutting the dusk, and for a moment I saw it a blank expanse where a face should be, a void that swallowed light. We froze, the dogs' barks, lost in the growing roar, the shapes closing in, to stand at the brink of something beyond understanding, knowing it watches you. We didn't run. We couldn't. The flashlight flickered out, plunging us into darkness. The shapes halted at the garden gate, the air stilling. We barricaded the doors, the dogs pressed against us, the night stretching, with every creak a menace. Morning revealed an empty street, but the gate bore deep scratches, as if clawed by something unnatural. My husband said nothing, but his eyes betrayed the truth we hadn't escaped. It followed us, a hunger that lingered a shadow in the hollows. Months later, the nightmares endure glimpses of it in reflections in shadows. My husband flinches at sounds the dogs cower. The countryside, once our haven, is now a cage, and that hollow herd waits its presence, a silent promise.